No Song But Silence. Windtide Book 3. Written by Jonathan Nevair. Narrated by Skylar Morgan. Book 1. 1. Location: Alteron System, Sagittarius Arm. Planet: Call 2, 180 miles southeast of the Finns. Year: 3071, third span. Sarat Akimsho held the voice tablet close to his lips and drew in a breath, words waiting on his tongue. Onyx-skinned fingers tightened their grip on the recording device. Speak it. It is time. The blazing light of Alteron, Call 2's rosy sun, beat down atop the dune's crest. He stood, frozen by an internal paralysis, despite the heat of the endless blue desert. Do it. His jaw clenched, rows of teeth like prison walls, denying the escape of words. Alteron's merciless rays pushed through his skin, fighting to melt his resistance. I can't. He lowered his hand. With relief, he strode along the sand ridge, weather-beaten sandals dangling from his other hand and swinging to the rhythm of his gait. Call 2's signature terrain gave way under his feet, cerulean sand cascading down the shaded leeward face of the serpentine peak. Once more, fear served as protectorate from what must be said. You hide in shadows behind veils, yet you walk the sands in the light. Stop being a contradiction. And a coward. Sarat halted. Ice-blue eyes scanned the desert expanse. In every direction, rolling dunes met an uninterrupted, cloudless pink sky. Think of those who have spoken out before you, and those of the future who will not if you don't do your part. His hands rose to his lips, a finger triggering the recording device. The elders were wrong about Call 2. The words had escaped. Silence returned, his statement vanishing into the arid emptiness. The desert's Spartan beauty ran in all directions, listening in earnest, yet refusing to respond to such petty human intrusions. The utterance might have dissolved into the hot desert air, but it was not lost. Sarat's device captured it and, out of prudence, covered it in linguistic disguise. With the first potent allegation set free, a rush of words welled up, anxious for liberation. Like a mass of incarcerated maxims held back by the weight of fear and dogmatic tradition, they broke out. Resentment toward years of immoral rule and political injustice grew into bold accusations, unleashed with his newfound liberation. Call 2 is a forgiving planet. Sarat's tongue moved with serpentine eloquence. The elders do not travel the rolling sands where the limbs sink in a gravitational embrace, nor do they relish the touch of wind on sheltered skin. A tickle of current cooled the perspiration, dappling his face. He ran his forearm along a pocked cheek, wiping the sweat back over his close-cropped red hair. Compared to the interior world of the Finns, the dunes were visceral and potent. His body came alive in response to the desert's empirical impositions. With a dexterous shove of his elbow, he adjusted the loose-fitting black robe where sweat stuck it to his side. The tablet rose to his mouth once more. The elders' movements outside the Finns are pragmatic. They remain anxious to return to our mirrored oasis, caring not for the empty silence where azure sands meet the rose-tinted sky. Sarat angled his face upward and closed his eyes. Alteron's rays seared his skin with the intensity of a burning wooden match nearing the fingers that held it. The wind is the lifeblood, the center of worship. It nourishes them with profit, but it is also their burden. He squinted, recovering his vision from the shelter of his eyelids. How do I know this? I dare to leave the confines and refuge of human intrusion and dominance. I have done so many times. I do it now. He strode on, swinging the hand with the sandals at his side. Freedom reigned out here. A form of liberation sang in the silence that he found nowhere else. There were always lessons to be learned in the desert, some revelatory, others horrors. Alone in the dunes, I see through the mirage. Sympathy is unveiled, revealing an ironic embrace, the human cycle of life and death. It's not about survival, it's about preservation. Call 2's winds blow free in the open desert. It does as it pleases, without physical or moral obstacles. Its chosen goal? To force the past to endure, with every ounce of arid effort. He bound down the shaded side of the dune, sending swaths of sand cascading with each footfall. A stark white intrusion, like a wave's crest, scraped off the top of an azure sea and tossed into a trench, interrupted the endless emptiness of the valley. His hand with the recorder lowered in lamentation. A lesson waited in the seam of the gully between the stretched shadows of the next rise. So today, it is horror. He edged closer. A tear intruded on the speckles of perspiration dappling his cheek. A forearm wiped it away, black fabric soaking up the moisture, but not the woe. The planet will not forget what we have done, he said, while lifting the recorder back to his lips. These 2 children before me scream its refusal. Their half-grown skeletons serve as a reminder of the cruelty and mistreatment my people perform through dogmatic insistence. Guilt and accountability are the siblings of memory. Call 2 refuses to allow us the privilege of forgetting. He stepped closer and sat, folding his legs across one another. Overhead, the breeze whispered. A reminder that Call 2 was a planet composed of wind and tide. The Targetians did not make this curse, but we enhanced its power. He tilted his head back to view the sky. And now, it repays us. Sarat's eyes shifted to the immortal image rising out of the sand. 2 bone-white skulls, their contrast to his living flesh at the extreme, lay no more than a foot beyond his crossed legs. Neck bones and hints of collarbone and shoulders sprouted like seeds from blue dust. Hollow sockets watched him with the patience of eternity. We are not alone in fault. The wind tide is a human invention, an intrusion into the ecological spirit of the arm. We reap more than air riled up into energy. It is a world system of opposites made manifest, an ebb and flow, where action and reaction form the lifeblood of justice, haunting us with perpetual stasis. We stagnate in a moral slack tide. Sarat contemplated the tableaus with the earnestness of a critic. What did these 2 children do to deserve this? What crime warranted this sentence? To be left to wither under Alteron's merciless sun, buried to their necks. More tears. These he let roll down his rugged cheeks to fall to the sand. The planet, unsure of their substance, refused them entry. They lay, glimmering on the desert skin, as if remnants of delicate jewelry worn by those buried before him. Conjured memory of their torment breaks me, he said, staring at the exposed bones. All the more because their deeds couldn't have buried them to the neck, left to die. They are too young to bear that responsibility. Sarat knew his people's forms of punishment. Children were sanded when their parents or caretakers did not repent or, in the case of outsiders, performed acts of hostility against the Finns. Whose crime was it that caused this forsaken punishment? A parent? A cultural resistance? Principled actions of my brethren? The vice of dogma? He shook his head. The answer spoken by my heart is not the one my mind believes. I fear an ironic fate is screaming into a human void. Criminality and its persecution are no longer appropriate frames for this paradox. Only once in Targishan history had two so young been sanded. Surratt had no doubt of their identity. These were the moat's children. He raised his free hand and pointed a finger at the morbid scene before his eyes. These remains laying before me are the planetary tragedy of eco-shaped sympathy. Here was today's haunting lesson. Call 2, through its unwavering preservation, refuses to allow us to forget. And as I said, it is a forgiving planet. Tidewave alert! The sobering voice on Surratt's wristcom broke through the diaristic meditation. Nimble fingers gripping the voice tablet shifted, thumb tapping the display to save the entry. His digits swept through a series of memorized movements, guiding the software protocol to cloak the words deep within the device's storage base. These thoughts were his alone. They had to be. If they weren't. Backdraft countdown, 22 minutes. Surratt shook his limb. The black robe covering his forearm shifted, exposing the comm strapped to his wrist. Alteron's bright midday light shimmered off his sweat-dappled skin. He rose, picked up his sandals, and strode to the dune. Call 2's sand, cooled on the shaded westward face, gave way with each step, leaving a trail of footprints that would vanish in less than half an hour. Nothing superficial remained after a tide wave passed. Even the dunes would be reshaped and reformed into a new landscape of monotonous beauty. At the crest, Alteron's intense rays forced him to squint. On the horizon line to the east, the rosy sky went dark, as if someone had swept a paintbrush across the rim of the planet. His black robe fluttered as the backdraft pulled the desert air towards the approaching wind tide. Flecks of sand drifted off ridge lines, sending wispy currents of blue-tinted dust streaming across the surface of the arid ocean. Surratt pulled the eye shield strapped around his neck up and over his eyes. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and ran a palm back over his short-cropped red hair. His hand met pooling moisture halfway back on the crown. He'd started losing his hair a decade ago at 40, but it mattered not. Targishans didn't regard hair highly, and all the citizens living in the Finns kept it to a minimum. Loose-fitting black robes and crimson hair groomed short and tight remained the ubiquitous fashion. Nothing stood stronger than tradition for the Targishans, not even individuality. So was it written in the Huluian texts since the time of Har-Targite. Surratt's grip on the voice tablet tightened. Was he proving that wrong? Not if these words were his alone, for private reflection. Tradition and conformity were manifest on his exterior. Could the same be said for his internal portrait? What use was a diary filled with not just autobiography, but criticism bordering on blasphemy? He couldn't deny it. The words he spoke today stepped over that line, yet he had no choice but to put them on record. Words are written to be read by others' eyes or heard by others' ears. Could he ever allow these entries to leave his internal world of resistance? 18 minutes to tide current reversal. Immediate evacuation recommended. Surratt pivoted eastward to face the backdraft. Sand cascaded down the dune around his bare feet. The single-person exploratory pod sat 2 crests back, looking like an overgrown armored beetle. Wind swirled around its sleek, matte black exterior. Sharp lines blurred at the craft's lower terminus, as if the transport were nestling into a cozy blanket. Targite lay beyond sight, at least 50 miles further than the visible horizon. He glanced at the skeletal remains of the children in the gully. Call 2's rising winds danced around them, whirlpooling sand, pulling them back into hidden memory. "I've lingered too long," he said, and slipped into his sandals. He'd needed to find another excuse to return if he hoped to continue to reap the inspiration of hermetic contemplation. It wouldn't be easy. Every excursion meant dancing a tenuous line. One false step, and his foot would slip off the dogmatic tightrope. He knew which side he'd tumbled down, and, judging by the recent looks of the elders, it might be less about his balance now. Cold, suspect eyes spoke of more than alienation. The power of those glares could affect his clandestine pursuits. Their gazes burned with accusations of heresy, simmering in weight. Surratt remote-activated the pod as he fought the strengthening backdraft, striding down to the first of the two dunes. The craft fired up, spewing dust from its rear burners. The pod disappeared behind the ridgeline, lost from sight as he made his way down the last gully. A plume of dusty cerulean wind coursed over his head against a pinkish sky as the whir of the pod's burners rose in pitch. Step by step, he lumbered upward on the last rise, clawing the sand with his free hand for added support. Judging by the volume of the pod's engines and the power of the backdraft, he'd waited too long. At least he wouldn't have to worry about being grounded, not with the pod running that loud. With the ignition charged up, the threat of sand clogging the system passed. His only concern now was that no one would. "Servant to Kim Shoti!" Surratt, mere steps from the dune's crest, looked up. He froze, one hand bracing himself against the angled sands. 3 black silhouettes stood against the rosy sky like stone monuments, blowing sand funneled around their statuesque forms before continuing toward the approaching tide wave. "How is it that you dare face the wind god alone?" The central figure of the robed triad lowered their hood. "Claude Toe." The aged priest curved one side of their mouth upward. The leader of the Vortex Triad, the highest enforcers of the tide laws of Haluian, waved a bony hand signaling Surratt should ascend to the crest. Surratt's eyes went to the voice diary in his hand. Could he throw it and hope it would be consumed or buried in the sand? The countdown window for safe departure before the wind tide ticked. Every second the priests searched the sands would bring them closer to imminent death. His heart spoke the answer. Words are written. "Come, servant. The god grows impatient," Claude said. Surratt climbed to the top of the dune. The unusual engine volume and sand discharge made sense now. On the second crest, back from his pod, stood a larger transport ship. How did they know I was here? "We've been aware of your treachery, your insolence, for longer than you think, servant to Kimsho," Claude said. They ripped the tablet from his hand. "Take this and go." The Vortex Enforcer handed the tablet to a robed figure to their right. The hooded Targetian accepted the device with a bow before making their way down the dune back to the larger craft, crossing paths with a lower-ranking tier member heading for Surratt's exploratory pod. The shorter length of one side of the subordinate's robe, marking them as 8th tier, told Surratt all he needed to know. Those present were of the highest disciplinary order. "I look forward to reading your," Claude snarled, the corner of their mouth rising a second time. "Musings. I assume that's what you do out here. Seek inspiration for some form of false, artful enlightenment?" "They are personal thoughts, Furious One." "There are no personal thoughts beyond those of the senses, servant." The long lines of age running from Claude's high cheekbones were like pillars of shadow. "All else is based on reason and is, and always will be, as it was written by the first." Surratt lowered his gaze. The backdraft whipped dust over his sandals. "How many others under your tutelage have you corrupted?" Claude asked. "Corrupted?" Surratt looked into their eyes. Growing darkness from behind him shaded the Furious One's steel-blue irises. "You are not the first blasphemer to dare challenge Halluian." The head Vortex eyed him with malice. "And you will not be the last. This is nothing new to Targite." Thin arms pulled their billowing black robe against a frail body. "And we will find the others, your budding dissidents. Our purge will cleanse the fins of those you have tainted, like the gust of wind from Halluian that blows clear everything in its path." Lazaro T. Would his apprentice be safe? "Farewell, heathen." Kalad smiled before turning to head for their ship. The remaining Targitian hissed and turned to follow their leader. "You're leaving me?" Surratt yelled, the rhetorical tinge to his words embarrassing and pathetic. "You've been seeking answers." The Furious One did not turn, but spoke loud enough that their words carried on the wind. "You wish to learn whether there is a wind god who judges us or not, and if they are just to those who defy them, if there is mercy." The backdraft stalled. Surratt's robe fluttered about. The wind shifted, slamming into his back. He fell forward a step and steadied himself by digging a leg into the dune's ridge. "Draft reversal. Tide wave imminent." Surratt did not need the warning from the wristcom. He knew as well as anyone else what loomed behind him. The lower-ranking Targitian closed the hatch on Surratt's pod. The Black Beetle rose in tandem with the larger ship, fighting gusts of hot air and blowing sand. Blue burners on both crafts intensified, and, with a deafening roar, the vessels shot off over the dunes, diminishing toward the horizon. A shadow fell over the sands. Alteron vanished, replaced by flashes of electromagnetic static. Dune ridges illuminated as streaks of cracked glass flickering in the ominous darkness. Surratt turned and faced the coming monstrosity. A wall of pitch denied him visual information. Screams howled and roared as the sand around him pulled away, like crashing water retreating for the next swell. His ankles sunk deeper into the dune. He had so much to say, more words to record for other eyes and ears, hidden thoughts that would never be manifest. "I am but a humble servant." The hair on his arms pricked up, skin tingling from electromagnetic activity. He lost his bearing in the howling darkness, sand up to his thighs. "I have not done wrong by this." Fires from 100 torches ran over his skin. "Someone else must." No living eyes watched Surratt Akimsho die. No ears heard his final words. Only the skeletal ghosts of 2 children bore witness, resting in the snug embrace of eternity's sands.